Thank you, everyone, for coming out to our fifth and final History of American Architecture Cranbrook Visitors Lecture. It has been a wonderful 5 weeks thinking about American architecture through the lens of the architects who have come through Cranbrook Academy of Art. It's an unusual way of looking at the history of architecture. It's created some interesting dynamics and some interesting comparisons that I, for one, would not have made without the impetus of this series. For the past 2 weeks, we have been really stuck in some theoretical places, and it is my delight tonight to introduce three architects who, in remarkable fashion, graduated from architecture schools in the 1990s, opened their offices by the late 90s and early 2000s, and by the time they came to Cranbrook in 2010, 2014, we're already building skyscrapers, museums, houses, and projects all around the world. So as we begin talking about Jeanne Gang, Gregg Pasquarelli, and David Adjaye, I just want to once again review where we've come from and where we're headed tonight. So we started our series with Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier and Alvar Aalto, these singular titans of modernism who helped bring architecture into the 21st century. The next week, we looked at the second generation of modernists and how one might solve problems of meaning and communication through modern architecture. The third week, with John Haydick, Aldo Rossi, and Stanley Tigerman, we saw architects dealing with meaning and also becoming increasingly detached from the actual act of construction. Last week, we saw the way that Elizabeth Diller, Johanni Palasma, and Jacques Herzog of Herzog and de Meuron began to reconsider construction and human interaction with architecture. Tonight, we see a new interaction between theory and the academy and construction. All of our architects were born in the mid-1960s. Jeanne Gang, who practices in Chicago, is known as a sort of down-to-earth visionary who places more value on what architecture can do for society than on being a starchitect. That in turn has helped elevate her into the highest level of her field. Gregg Pasquarelli is interested in how practice, politics, finance, technology, and sustainability can be combined so that the architect regains some control on how buildings are built. And his office, Shop Architects, are unique among the firms we've looked at for not only designing buildings, but also developing buildings. And our last visitor, Sir David Adjaye, is a Ghanaian English architect who is probably the most famous architect practicing in the world today. You could say, certainly the most famous English architect. And while each of these architects have no signature style, they all are displaying a real interest in the combination of research, history, theory, and construction and the actual act of building. They came to Cranbrook in 2010 and then 2014 under the architect in residence, William Massie, who I'll introduce in a moment, and under another moment in time where Cranbrook was led by a director who was an architect, Reed Kroloff. So it was the first time the Academy, or rather the third time the Academy had been led by an architect president, starting way back in 1931 with Eliel Saarinen establishing the architecture department, and the next year the Academy of Art. In our second week, we looked at the head of architecture, Glenn Paulson, with his late modernist inclinations, and then the revolution at Cranbrook Academy of Art with the incoming leadership of Daniel Libeskind, who brought high theory, high concept, and abstraction to Cranbrook. Last week, we looked at Dan Hoffman, who, as a pupil of the Cooper Union and kindred spirit of Daniel Libeskind, continued to emphasize theory over practice, even if he was more interested in building construction. This week, our vignette, our moment in time of the 2010s, is all taking place under the leadership of architect in residence William Massie. Bill Massie got his BFA in architecture from Parsons School of Design in New York, and then got his Master's of Architecture from Columbia in the Graduate School of Architecture. He worked for James Stewart Polshek Partners, and then he started his own office in 1993, the same year he began to teach building technologies research at Columbia. It was at Columbia where he met Reed Kroloff, as well as Gregg Pasquarelli, one of our visitors for tonight. The picture here is Massie sitting in American House number 8, which was on display at Cranbrook Art Museum in the spring and summer of 2008, and it is a fully prefabricated home that Massie designed and constructed in a warehouse in Pontiac. It was then delivered from the warehouse in the top center down Woodward Avenue and reconstructed in front of the art museum. And this project embodied Massie's belief that the future of architecture lay in computer-aided design, in prefabrication, and in a blend of technology and construction. So you see him sitting on that IKEA couch with an Eames chair in front of him, and all of this building, you'll see how it clicks together like a puzzle. So you may even see that puzzle joint running down the wooden wall. Once it was assembled on site, a new plaster ceiling was installed, the cork floor rolled out, and this house had been delivered by truck onto its site. He attempted to sell it on eBay after the exhibit. I'm not sure what actually happened to the house, but it reflects his ideas about architecture and how he was teaching the students here at Cranbrook and the visitors he invited to speak. Other pieces important to Massie's development included the 2002 Museum of Modern Art exhibit at the PS1 Contemporary Art Center called Playa Urbana, or Urban Beach, on the top left. In the top center, another prefabricated housing module that would be constructed in a factory and delivered out into the field. On the upper right, a movie theater in rural Alabama. Below that, a prefabricated home that was delivered by Massie to Montana. And then if you're using a computer and you're using robotic arm construction, then you can also design elements like this sink that was CNC milled through computer files designed by Massie and then installed in the house. Or my favorite of Cranbrook's modern gates in the lower left-hand corner, the Vaughan Road gates that Massie designed to be plasma cut out of sheet steel and then unfolded like a paper airplane and riveted together. So a new way of creating gates through computer and building technologies. What's interesting about Massie, as well as all of our visitors tonight, is where they fall on the spectrum of theory and practice. As we'll see, each of our architects is dedicated to actually getting buildings built. And I'll borrow from Gregg Pasquarelli, our middle visitor, a slide that he presented in his lecture, where he traced the history of architecture over the past 30 years from the craftsman journeyman, which I would actually expand it and say that this chart works all the way back to cathedral times, the craftsman journeyman, up to Eliel Saarinen, who too was a craftsman, to the humanist intellectual architect, think of Louis Kahn or Alvar Aalto, to the modernist visionary, think of Le Corbusier, or really any architect who viewed modernism as the way to save humanity and architecture. But what Pasquarelli was most disturbed by was this split. And this is what happened in the 1970s and 80s, where you had paper architects on the one hand who existed really solely in the academy, in universities, and whose architecture existed in written theory and in drawings. And then service architects, which Pasquarelli defines as those firms like the alphabet soup offices of SOM, KPF, are HOK, these mega firms with hundreds, if not thousands, of architects cranking out buildings of varying quality, but buildings whose roofs don't leak, don't go over budget, and generally meet and serve the needs of the client. And Pasquarelli argued in his lecture at Cranbrook that he wanted to lead a firm that could combine the best of paper architecture with service architecture. And why does good architecture need to be sort of overly expensive or overly complicated theoretically? I think this chart works for all of our practitioners tonight, beginning with Jeanne Gang. Born in Belvidere, Illinois, she studied her undergraduate degree at the University of Illinois and got her master's from Harvard. She then studied at the same school in Zurich, where Herzog and de Meuron studied. And after graduation, she worked for Rem Koolhaas at the Office of Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam. Koolhaas's office is known for being a research-based practice with deep understanding of modernism and its social and political aspirations. It's also an office that uses models, and that is something that Jeanne Gang and her firm remain dedicated to, the construction of physical scale models for buildings that will inevitably be digitized and then constructed. She came back to Chicago in 1997 and established her own studio. She considered Stanley Tigerman a mentor in this lineage of Chicago architects. In her lecture at Cranbrook, she talked about architecture being, or her firm rather, being dedicated to actionable idealism. And she wants to live in a world where humans can coexist, actively support one another, and where architecture serves as a point of connection and interaction rather than standalone office or objects. In 2010, when she spoke at Cranbrook in the auditorium of Cranbrook Institute of Science, the art museum was under renovation. She was leading a 37-person firm. She has over 100 architects today. And I thought it was interesting in her lecture that she started out with a slide showing that her office was a little bit more than half women, and it was a pretty diverse screen. But in her words, she said, "This is pretty diverse, but it could be more diverse." And I think it's interesting because probably in 2010, she had one of the most gender equal firms in the country, not to mention the racial and ethnic diversity that she also employed. But even then, she knew that architecture could be and should be more diverse. And so moving forward in 2018, she established pay equity across gender in her office, and she is acknowledging the fact that she's one of the very few women at the top of an architecture firm in the country. Now, I mentioned that she uses models for design. And so the first project she spoke about at Cranbrook was the Starlight Theater. It's near her hometown and it's at a community college. The college had a renowned outdoor summer theater program, but it would often be canceled because of rain. They wanted a roof. They hired a number of architects to come in, and they were really uninspired by the projects that were proposed. Jeanne Gang goes in and she says, "I want to build you a star-shaped six-sided triangle that opens up. So you have the best of outdoor theater that your community and you love, but you also have some sort of outdoor control." The dean, who happened to be a hydraulic engineer, looked at her model, said, "This will work, and thank you for respecting us enough to bring something ambitious to our little project with a little budget at a community college." And I think that reflects her idea that architecture belongs to everyone and the sort of responsibility she sees as an architect and that we'll see tonight in the projects of her studio. It was constructed over 3 summers, starting with a rebuilding of the amphitheater, a rebuilding of the stage box, and lastly, constructing this incredible 20 triangle roof with 6 interior triangles that flip open slowly on jack motors. Then open and close for intermission. Each one weighs 15 tons, and each one has its own electric motor, so it's quite quiet. Jeanne Gang told the Cranbrook audience that it became a town event to go out and watch the building open and close. She said there wasn't much to do, and she said, I can say that because I'm from there. I know there's not much to do other than watch my theater open and close. The triangles have an internal lightweight structural support that allows them to essentially be counterbalanced as they flip open and closed. And in the section cut, we can see how the theater is a fully enclosed building that the school can use year round. And then in the summer, they can go out into the open air pavilion. Here you can see a staging of Anything Goes in the theater. And I think that this reflects Jeanne Gang's belief in never aiming low. She thought of the right idea, the client went with it, and she really creates this theatric architecture akin to what we saw with Elizabeth Diller last week, except Diller's stage was simply a construction for the audience to view and move. And then thinking of Aldo Rossi and his idea of architecture being a stage set. And I think Jeanne Gang has combined the sort of thrill of mechanical architecture with the sort of beauty of Rossi's idea that architecture is theater. And of course, at the end of the show, once the sun has set, the roof reopens and you're given this sort of star field through the star-shaped Starlight Theater roof. The next project she discussed was the marble curtain that she designed for her mentor and Chicago architect extraordinaire, Stanley Tigerman, an exhibit that he curated at the National Building Museum, where he challenged young architects to come up with new ways to use stone materials. The sort of cone of light is made of 670 laminated and water jet cut pieces of marble that are joined together through structural silicone joints. It's 1,500 pounds suspended from 19 stainless steel anchors. And there is no internal structure here. It's just the marble and silicone that are linked together. And Jeanne Gang talks about the studio being a place where material research and exploration of can you do something is vitally important to the practice, whether or not there is an explicit building that's going to come out of the research. And this photograph that she took is of some of her associates at the IIT campus, where they tested the marble by pulling it apart until it fractured and shattered. All around the studio in Chicago, there are natural materials. There are materials experiments from buildings, but then there's also things like bird nest, which lead into the next project, and one that I really admire and respect. In the south side of Chicago, on what had been a steel yard and turned into a junkyard, the city of Chicago wanted to turn it into a bird migration point on the Mississippi Flyway. The idea was to build a community and nature center, and Jeanne Gang proposed looking at a bird's nest and essentially doing the same thing for her building. She had walked around downtown Chicago with the Audubon Society, and as she discussed the sort of birds and cities, they were also collecting dead birds that flew into the glass of skyscrapers. She decided that her architecture should be part of the solution, not part of the problem. All of her buildings going forward have had bird mitigating glass elements. But for this nature center, she proposes essentially wrapping the building in a bird's cage so the birds don't even have a chance to get close to the glass. The project would have been built alongside this sort of marshland and natural landscape, and it would have been constructed through the scrap material on site or at a nearby junkyard. And she created this visual inventory, which sort of points to the wealth of resources that could be diverted out of the waste or recycling stream and into her architecture. Recycling, of course, is great, but it's energy intensive. And her idea was, can I just use the material as it is without going through the process of reinventing it with energy and smoke and the sort of labor of recycling? Can I just take this Aluminum pipe are copy machine rollers, grills from stamped machine plates, aluminum section, stainless steel discs are in the lower right bundled steel highway signs, and then convert them into a building. That is Gang's own hand there holding out this future building material. And I'm reminded again of Le Corbusier and the two distinct ways of architectural thought reflected in these two images. One, the architect as the sort of giver of abstract form in this grand model, and the other, the architect sort of out in the field gathering up materials for a project. She proposed essentially over-engineering the building so that whatever material was available when construction began, they would bundle these sticks together. And so there's really no construction document. It's more of a, how many pipes do you have to bundle to support the weight of the roof? And it reminds me a little bit of sculptor Marc de Suveroux, both for the visual connection of bundled pipes, but also in Cranbrook's example of the artist work, that brown section on that's the counterweight to the piece is actually a piece of old Long Island Expressway bridge work. And de Suveroux simply cut up the bridge and then used it as the anchor for his sculpture without any further manipulation. And I think it is this really interesting way to think about recycling and reuse that both de Suveroux and Gang shared. The next project she presented began with a map that the studio created. They're always involved in research projects, sometimes for clients, other times just for the studio. And here, Studio Gang is comparing on the left the census map of Chicago with ethnicities by neighborhood, and then on the right, architectural density according to the AIA Guide of Chicago. And so in the center of Chicago, in the loop, you see this real dense sort of conglomerate of architecture. And then in the predominantly white neighborhoods, you see architecture remains going up the north side. But down here, we have these huge architectural deserts. And Jeanne Gang looked at these maps and said, why should there not be quality architecture there too? And so she proposed, where I've put this red dot, building a community for the SOS Family Services Network, a foster care center. And she begins to think of the building as layering almost like geologic space, but also layering of different neighborhoods that intersect in this triangular site, the rail lines, the road lines, commercial buildings, and residential. And she makes this interesting model of different colored plaster poured together. And in the end, she designs a building that's on an incredibly shoestring budget with mostly donated material and donated her own firm's time. And they create this sculptural concrete wall that provides two sides of the building. She wanted to use donated concrete where each concrete mix would be a different color and texture because it came from a different site. In the end, the logistics didn't quite work out. And so she had the donated concrete simply mixed in different colors. It was then poured into the formwork and lightly sandblasted so that the building is given this sort of striation that shows, I think, the way that concrete is poured, how it flows and then hardens. And it's a real sort of partnership between the architect, her contractor, and the actual form makers and concrete pourers. As she says, behooves the architect to collaborate between scientists, artists, craft workers, and community members. And I love that she uses the term craft workers, which solves the gendered issue of craftsmen. When you go inside of this structure, she packs a lot of architecture into a little corner site. Again, on a low budget, she creates this sort of amphitheater stair that then leads to a series of classrooms and community rooms. It serves not only the foster care network, but it also serves the larger community. And in her lecture at Cranbrook, Jeanne Gang said she knew it was a success when she heard back from the community that they were not just using the building for its design purpose, but they were also having birthday parties, retirements, and even weddings in the building. And she knew that she had brought a valuable and appreciated work of architecture that the community was enjoying because it was expanding its use. When you look at the building and then you look at this picture that Gang took near her family home on Lake Superior, I think you can see the way that geology influences her practice. And what's remarkable is that just 10 years on from opening her studio, she becomes the tallest building in the world built by a woman architect, Aqua Tower. And she gets this commission as she tells the students at Cranbrook in 2010 that you have to take the opportunities where they come and you will never know where that opportunity is. She had gone to a Harvard alumni dinner in Chicago where Frank Gehry was the speaker. She had a pleasant evening. She had sat next to a gentleman. They had polite conversation. And a few weeks later, she got a call from that man who said, I am developing a skyscraper. I've gone through all the architects. I've looked at your website. I want you to design it. You probably don't have a firm yet large enough, but we can make that happen. And suddenly she is designing a skyscraper. She thinks of the surface like almost like a cliff dwelling or some sort of natural landscape. And she envisions the tower as having this sort of rock-like formation. As built, it does come off more aquatic, where you have these pools of glass, where the balconies go into the edge of the building. The glass becomes thermal rated, so it's reflecting the sun as opposed to being shaded by the balcony. And the design of where these pools appear on the surface comes from what they're looking at. So if there is a view towards the lake or towards a significant vista, the balconies become larger, and where the view is blocked, the balconies come closer to the building. When she took this to the contractor said, to make every floor slab different will add probably 4 hours of work per floor. That doesn't sound too bad until you add it all up, and that's 6 months more in the construction process and untold millions more dollars. So she goes to her research division, they think about it, and they create a system whereby they could use the same concrete formwork, but manipulate a sort of plastic sleeve to give these wavy shapes as the building went up much more quickly than building wooden forms custom for every floor. As you get closer, the building begins to transform. And then when you stand under it, you have this really unique sort of topography going up towards the sky. I think she was interested in this view as much as she was interested in the idea of building a vertical neighborhood and thinking about how the residents would communicate diagonally across balconies, as well as how the balconies form these views in and around Chicago. And she went on a mission designing these railings to find the best railing design possible. And it's always a good architect who is willing to admit that all architects use precedent, what has come before, but to do it in such a methodical way as to take your clipboard and camera and go all around Chicago photographing balconies, I think reflects the Studio Gang approach to research and design. They settle on the iconic Marina City, the corncob balconies. And what's interesting is that Bertram Goldberg used identical fiberglass forms going all the way up, which was his own sort of technological revolution. Jeanne Gang then uses movable fiberglass forms to create different balconies. So you see the same material creating very different effect in across the decades here. And of course, her railing is coming directly from Marina City. The next project was a nature boardwalk where this lake on this body of water on the left that was a shallow concrete lined reflecting pool was converted into a naturalized deepened nature preserve attached to a free zoo. Her office counted something like 50 species of plants, insects, and animals before the project. Afterwards, they've counted 700 and growing. So they've really naturalized the site. The boardwalk provides a community event space. And then there's this little wooden pavilion that the zoo can rent out to help raise funds, as well as being used by community members on a day-to-day basis. It's constructed out of this unique glue laminated construction system that when she took it to the city planners, they said, you can't build this. It's not tested, it's not fire rated, it doesn't meet code. And she said, the zoo doesn't have the money to build this. Instead of saying, I'll have to redesign it, I'll have to spend more money, why don't I simply get this approved? And so in the 4 years it took to raise $700,000 for the project, she got the approvals for her unique construction system. And that is the sort of clever use of time and energy that allowed this building to finally be realized. Now, each of these sort of shapes is covered by a fiberglass pod, which were inspired by milkweed pods found on the site. And though she wouldn't quite describe herself as a biomorphic designer, someone who designs directly from nature, this is distinctly biomorphic design. And it is taking it's noticing the Earth's own designs, the Earth's rhythms, and then expressing them in the architecture. And this design doesn't necessarily solve an ecological challenge directly, but I do think that it helps us to imagine how we and our buildings are connected to nature. Another pod-like little house that she designed in a sort of residential neighborhood of Chicago has this beautiful brick screen. And the brick screen is only 1 brick thick, so it's attached to a steel frame that has these distinct clips. When her structural engineer would not sign off for the legal liability of the system, because it was masonry, and her mason wouldn't sign off because it was attached to steel, she went to the brick company that made the clips and she said, do you believe in this product that we have designed together? And they said yes. And she said, well, then let's do all the testing to get this approved by the city building department. And the inside, it dapples the light and provides this sort of intimate courtyard garden in the front yard. She also discussed the Columbia College Media Production Center, which is America's largest film school, but their first purpose-built building. And it has this distinct multicolored facade inspired by the test screen that the film students would be all too familiar with. In the back of the building are film studios, and then the front of the building, she uses different cinematic effects inspired by the dean of the school, who sent Jeanne Gang 5 movies that she thought were the most important 5 movies, and then Gang took these lessons from Citizen Kane and other films and began to adapt framing devices and shadows and deploying them into the building. So architecture as a sort of sequence of unfolding spaces. Now, at the end of her lecture, someone asked about a new project that was just on the drawing boards. Since it's not 2010, we can fast forward and look at her little building in Kalamazoo that I'll hope you'll go and check out. I've been there. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a center for social justice, and it is constructed in a wooden masonry method. She thought a center for social justice should be all about transparency and connection. So each window looks out at a different entity, the town, the neighborhood, and the university. And then the building is built using this distinctly Scandinavian upper Midwest building technology that probably hadn't been used in a century, surely had not been used in a institutional setting. And then the inside has this sort of updated mid-century modern open space interior. Since her lecture at Cranbrook, her firm has grown, tripled in size, and if you head to her website, you'll see all sorts of fascinating projects on the drawing boards. I'm highlighting just a few here, including again for a architectural desert for the city of Chicago, a new series of boathouses. Her solstice in the park, which makes me think of Stanley Tigerman and his mega structures for Chicago, those glass pyramids, or the global terminal at O'Hare, where she proposes using a timber frame structure that would train youth in sort of wood construction techniques and develop skill sets for later employment by using these off-site wood fabricated sites. Now, her firm also is involved in community outreach and research projects, including these community cafes, where she designed an exhibition for the Cooper Hewitt alongside citizens of the Chicago 10th District. And she worked between police, the community, and her office to try and figure out how they could transform police stations into community centers. The last project I'll look at of hers, because it has such a close Cranbrook connection, are stage buoys that she designed for a performance art piece by Cranbrook alum Nick Cave. Nick Cave creates these sound suits that are costumes, they are dress, they are sculptures, they're charged with sort of associations and with meaning, but they're meant to be worn and danced in. And in a Chicago performance, he worked with Jeanne Gang to create these mylar wrapped cardboard columns that are attached to cast concrete spheres. So as the dancers moved through the works, the costumes would create sway and reflection all around. I think it shows the sort of deep interest that she has in design and aesthetics, but also in technology and materials, in art and in community. Our next visitor, Gregg Pasquarelli of the Office Shop of Brooklyn, New York, or of Manhattan, New York, came to Cranbrook 4 years later in 2014. He has had an exceptional career, up to an office of 185 architects when he spoke here in 2014. And he was interested in realigning architecture to construction and to development. And he was speaking as the J. Robert F. Swanson Lecturer, a lecture series that began in 1983, in which had fallen out of use. It was revived by Reed Kroloff and Bill Massie to bring David Adjaye and Gregg Pasquarelli to Cranbrook in 2014. And I think that Reed Kroloff, who, remember, was director of the Academy and an architect, summed up what these Pasquarelli, Adjaye, and Gang are doing in architecture in his introduction. Kroloff said, "What you're seeing now is the development of a group of people who in their 20s and early 30s rewrote the book, the manual about how one makes architecture, how one thinks about architecture, how one envisions architecture, how one manufactures architecture. Or in Bill Massey's case, fabricates or prefabricates architecture. This is the vanguard. And what we're having the great pleasure of experiencing tonight is what happens when the vanguard reaches the age in our profession when they can really make substantial work. Shop has become the extraordinary, sterling example of how this is done, a firm that somehow skipped the little buildings." And remember this sort of graph that Gregg Pasquarelli began his Cranbrook lecture out of practice with. And Pasquarelli's disillusionment with theory began in his time as a student at Columbia, where he said everyone was designing in the computer and everyone had to have a sort of French theorist behind their project. And the students joked that if they got up and just talked about a building, they'd be ripped to pieces. They had to get up and talk about theory. And if any of the critics asked, "What is your building made of?" they would say, "Transparent aluminum, like Wonder Woman's plane." And Pasquarelli sort of sees this as incredibly limiting for architecture, this abdication of design under this sort of hood of theory. He did not want to go and work for Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. He wanted to build buildings, and he wanted to build buildings at the forefront of architecture. He and his 5 partners got the chance when they won the Museum of Modern Art's first competition for an installation in the summer of 2000. It's a bar, restaurant, music space, sort of nightclub in the museum courtyard, and it's built out of these 2x2 cedar wooden beams, bars. And every architecture student around the country does a project like this. I did it. It is the sort of architecture school 101. Stick some sticks together and make a shape. But what's fascinating about this one is that it is fully computer driven. And so he created the design, or the firm created the design in the computer, and the blueprints looked like this. How do you get a design from a computer into physical space? They were not winging it. Instead, they printed this blueprint at full scale, and then they were their own labor, and they screwed everything together by setting it onto this paper, and then erecting it one by one. And he was trying to solve a problem that an earlier project that he had worked on with his teacher at Columbia, Gregg, where they designed this blobby church, but then when it was built, it ended up being over budget and overly complicated and not really blobby at all, because there was no way to get their early computer blob into built space. Now, Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Airlines, sees this project, and he invites Shop to come and design a prefabricated airport lounge. And what you're seeing is CNC milled, computer-generated lumber that was milled out, and the drill, would carve a number on the piece of wood, and then it was taken to JFK, and they simply stacked them up by number. So again, designed in the computer, milled by a robot, and then stacked up in the field without any sort of blueprint. In Korea, he was, from the success of those two projects, given the commission to design a bookshop that uses a similar computer-generated timber form. And on the inside, it is this classic Le Corbusian ramp from the ground floor through the bookshelves and up to a cafe on the roof. The firm then won a competition to put a sort of new front on the Fashion Institute of Technology's brutalist concrete building. And in this narrow 20-foot building, it was a raised sidewalk where you can see the movements of the staircases climbing up through a series of critique spaces, fabrication labs, meeting rooms, outdoor courtyards, all of it generated by computer design. And this project was never built. The funding never came through. The next project he presents in his Cranbrook lecture is a little park on Long Island. And this is an interesting project because you had a mayor who really wanted a significant work of architecture and a city council who was less enthused. They had had a competition. Shop came in third place. The winner ended up backing out. The second place architect did not want to commute from Paris. And the city council said, let's just hire a local person. All we need to do is put some grass, put the carousel out, put a gazebo. And the mayor said, no, we need a work of architecture. We need the architect's mind to establish sort of how this can best be used for our community. And so he called Pasquarelli in New York, and he said, I need you to come out here. I need you to not wear all black, as is the vogue of architects. I need you to not use any jargon. I want no French theorist. And I want you to tell my city council and my community how you're going to build it and why your design should be built in clear language. And this was a very important lesson for the young firm because it showed them the politics that are necessary to getting your work built. The last project was the mayor's sort of pet folly, which was a camera obscura. So that part jutting out of the building reflects daylight into the space, and it projects the image of the ships in the harbor onto a white surface. It's a 18th century Enlightenment invention brought forward into the most modern building construction imaginable, because this whole project was built, again, without blueprints, entirely through a kit of parts. As Pasquarelli told the Cranbrook audience, this piece attaches to this piece in the most kick-ass piece of IKEA furniture you've ever seen in your life. Even the concrete foundations were pre-milled by a robotic arm and then brought to the site, and the concrete poured into the milled form. Pasquarelli told the contractor, if you ever hear a saw, something's gone wrong. The entire building will be cut and then clicked together. In the end, the construction workers enjoyed the project. They thought it was pretty genius. They got really into something they had been quite hesitant about. They had no skills in computer clicking, clicking of computer parts together. But for Pasquarelli, what this showed was that architects could reclaim design by using technology to assist in construction. If he had simply designed this and then said, build it the traditional way, it would have been much more expensive. They would have had to engineer it to make it more simple. But instead, he replaces the sort of labor of time, energy, and production so that he ends up with a more interesting product through a revolutionary ends. And he tells the Cranbrook audience that you couldn't build a skyscraper with this with this method, but you could get 90% of the skyscraper built in traditional detailing. And then that 10%, the 10% that people see, why not think of these new methods of construction? And for him, that is the real future of architecture. This project led to a competition for the East River waterfront, which the competition entry stated that you had to be a New York-based architect who had completed a New York park on a waterfront. Limited entries, shop wins, and they proposed this 1.3-mile linear park. It is now completed and open for your strolling pleasure. And what the real sort of fundamental development of this project was to see the elevated highway not as a barrier to the park, but as a free roof. And so they push all of the landscaping up to the roof, and then we'll see what they do underneath the actual road. He realized that the barrier was going to block your eye for a lower chair. So he went through the intense process of getting bar stools approved by the city so that you could eat your lunch and actually see the waterfront view. And then he uses the highway as this sort of waterproof membrane for then little pavilions to be strung along the park under. He also paints the highway lilac and then works with a lighting designer to create this soft mood lighting. As he told the Cranbrook audience, I guarantee if you're on a date, you'll make out with whoever you take down there. It also involved the reconstruction of a number of piers, which gave over 60,000 new square feet of parkland in lower Manhattan. And these are made of recycled red plastic underneath, and then park space above and programmed interior spaces below. The next project is probably the one that makes him a controversial designer and shop a controversial firm. Because for this building, the architecture firm bought this series of warehouses and a 6-story warehouse and developed it themselves with other investors. And as Pasquarelli notes in his books and lecture, the Academy says that this is somehow going to undercut your art, that this is a terrible thing to do. And even the American Institute of Architects says you really should not do this. This is not in the role of an architect to be a developer. But what Pasquarelli has realized is that if you want to build innovative architecture, showing your developer, your investors, your client that you have skin in the game, that you're not going to just build the most expensive building possible or the most elaborate building possible, that you are financially invested in realizing an architecture that is functional and beautiful, it allows you significantly more design freedom. They created a computer script that would tell them do a cost engineering analysis of how far the building could hang over these lower buildings and be cost effective. Essentially, they had the air rights here to build a taller building. They transferred them on top of this 6-story tower so they could see the Hudson River, but they had to be 15 feet back from the street there. And so they end up hanging the building, doing some elaborate but cost-effective engineering to have it cantilevered over. And then they wrap it in prefabricated computer milled zinc. And this entire system was built without blueprints and entirely computer based. And when they get to the last piece of zinc and they clip it in, they had a 3/8 inch tolerance. And so that shows you the precision that you can achieve through these methods of computer design. There's also a thickness to the windows that was intentional, part of the architecture, but they didn't want pigeons to roost. And so they called up the Museum of Natural History and asked, is there an angle of repose that pigeons aren't comfortable with? And so they angled all of the windows at 32 degrees so that it's a pigeon poop free black building. At night, the white stripes are actually lights, and the whole building begins to reflect the transition of the neighborhood from meatpacking district into arts and culture district. Also on the drawing boards when Pasquarelli spoke at Cranbrook was the redevelopment of the Domino Sugar site into a mixed-use community, which now has the first projects being completed. I used to live in an apartment that backs up to this view. Uh, he also talked about his designs for Google and Mountain View, building a large circular Guggenheim-like ramp building where all of the offices are floating in space. And he also showed a competition-winning design for a innovation tech hub in Botswana. And this is meant to be a center for the southern, South African foreign and local business and technology companies. This project is just wrapping up now, and here are some photos of the building built. He also presented the remarkable 60-foot wide by 1,400-foot tall 111 West 57th Street, part of the Billionaires Row. This tower at the top is only 8 feet wide by 60 feet, and it has these remarkable views back and forth across Manhattan. And the engineering that goes into making this happen is really quite stunning. It's substantially taller than the Empire State Building, and Shop clads it in these prefabricated terracotta and bronze panels that run all the way up into the sky. In this project, he said, "We never really had a budget, and now we do, and we're going to spend it." The last project that he spoke about was his Atlantic Yards redevelopment, a project that Frank Gehry designed in 2003 for a stadium suspended between 4 residential towers. With the Obama administration coming in 2009, they took out some tax loopholes for stadium construction, and Bruce Ratner, the developer, realized he was going to lose $400 million if he did not break ground by the end of 2009. The Frank Gehry project was mired in permission and neighborhood objections, and so he simply goes out to Indianapolis and he buys the blueprints from Ellerby Beckett from the Conesco Field House, and he says, "I'm just going to build this in Brooklyn." He then goes to Shop and says, "I've got the engineering plans, construction started. Can you essentially make a new skin?" Shop ends up saying yes, but they don't want it to be a skin job. They want to take over the entire envelope and the interior design. They end up building a Core 10 wrapper on the structure using building information modeling, BIM software. And all of these panels were constructed off-site. They were molded, folded, and then hung on a custom dry cleaning system that moved them around a Brooklyn warehouse as they went through misters and fans to create corrosion on the surface of the metal so that it would not corrode on site. After 3 months being misted and hanging, they then were tagged. An iPhone app was used by the contractors to track these panels as they were then installed and lifted into place on the building. The front of the Barclays Center has this great oculus, which Pasquarelli joked were the arms of Bernini, Brooklyn style, and it is New York's first great public space of the 21st century. It's a plaza that has since been used for celebrations, for protest, and it really has formed a new center here in downtown Brooklyn underneath the stadium overhang of 200 by 85 feet. On the inside, the firm made it all black and gave it theater lighting, and they even were involved in the change from the New Jersey Nets to the Brooklyn Nets, the color to all black, because as Shop told the Nets, if you want to sell merchandise in New York, it needs to be all black. In the end, they did create, I think, a downtown stadium that fits within this unique downtown Brooklyn landscape. Like the Frank Gehry plan, it now is being ensconced in residential skyscrapers, 50% of which are affordable housing, and all of which were built in Brooklyn in modular construction. These are the tallest modular buildings in the world. The firm has continued to build and has really incredible projects on the drawing boards, from a custom brick textile building in New York, to the American Copper twin buildings in New York, to Uber Air's landing ports. And here in Detroit, they are responsible for the reconstruction of the Hudson site. Our last visitor is a Tanzanian-born British architect of Ghanaian descent, who grew up between Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Ghana, Egypt, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia, all before the age of 13, the son of a diplomat. At 13, he settled in London, where he then went on to the Royal Academy, studying architecture, particularly Western architecture, because he was the only Black student, and he felt the need to study European modernism in order to try and get a foothold into the sort of world of architectural culture he was attempting to enter. A trip to Japan, a study abroad while he was a student, showed him how the simplicity of Japanese architecture and its natural materials might be used as a way of reforming African architecture. And he saw a similarity between the architecture of his childhood in Africa and Japanese design. For almost 11 years, from 2000 to 2011, he traveled around Africa with his camera, visiting all of the major 54 metropolitan areas. And in a seminal book that was also the start of his lecture at Cranbrook, he traced this photographic survey of metropolitan architecture. And he wants to reframe our thought of Africa away from the sort of Berlin-based colonial map to one of ecology and urbanism, and celebrating the 6 different regional ecologies in Africa and the way that those have affected city building. His lecture, this was about the first 15 minutes of it, and then he showed a selection of projects that I will show now. It is amazing how many buildings Adjaye Associates have produced, and I encourage you to check out some of the books that have been written on the firm or their website. We're just going to look at the ones that he introduced to the Cranbrook audience 6 years ago. Starting with the Sunken House in London, where he discussed the sort of interruption to the Georgian terraces that his home provided, where one neighbor sold off the back half of their garden, so it's a tiny site, and he proposed an all-black wooden cube. And the neighbors weren't happy, but the way planning permission works in England is that you go before the planning board and you make an argument as to why your building should be built. And he had a compelling narrative as to why his building should be built. And so here we have this real, I think, landmark and early work in his career. Built near the Adjaye studios for a photographer. The exterior is treated black wood, and the windows are inoperable. So in order to ventilate the house, there are these shutters that open up into this all-white Corbusian interior. On a whole nother scale, for a multi-billionaire investor and art collector in New York, Adjaye designed an 11,000 square foot, in his words, thing. This is a project that no longer appears on the firm's website and isn't featured in most of their books. And I do wonder how this project for a billionaire has aged and what Adjaye, the direction he wants to take his firm. But you can't pass up an opportunity like this to save a historic landmark carriage house facade and then build a temple of art behind. It enters through a bridge into this incredible door that opens into a gallery for the family's collection. Leading up and down over 7 levels, a series of pools and light wells shine across a pretty incredible collection of Basquiats and Calders and African art and sculpture. And the bedrooms are then accessed through these highly glazed, colorful hallways that lead into these dark, sort of mysterious chambers with these interesting angled windows cut into the concrete walls. And then from the back, we see the way that this concrete building sort of floats between the two larger apartments, and then it goes all the way down underground, and it actually goes lower than the much older neighbors. And so what you're seeing here is Manhattan schist that has been excavated even further down, so the very earth under Manhattan. And what Adjaye talks about is wanting to not over vibrate the concrete so that you actually see in the cured concrete this flow of dyed black concrete, sort of really rough and really textured, and expressing this once fluid, now rigid material in the architecture. The next project he introduced could be compared to the Weissenhof Siedlung that we looked at in week 1, where 24 different world-renowned architects are invited to build a little suburban enclave. Instead of in Stuttgart, these architects are working in the outskirts of Nanjing, China. Adjaye's house is this great wall in the tradition of wall houses that we've seen, from John Haydock's wall house to Stanley Tigerman's hot dog house. Here it is a home and studio built just like in Stuttgart with no client in mind. It is just a demonstration of architectural ideas. You enter the house through this door, seen here before the bamboo grove was planted, but it intentionally takes you through a bamboo grove. And from one side, you can enter into an all-white studio. And then in the other side, you enter into this concrete framed living space. And it has in section cut these almost ship-like bows that swing down, these bubbles that hold the private rooms of the house. You scamper up the stairs into these great curving spaces. And at the end of the bar is the dining room, which has this incredible concrete vault leading up to a skylight. Just like Frank Lloyd Wright, he wanted to dematerialize the corner, but there is actual structure there. And so he uses a complex system of granite and polished steel mirror to reflect the creek outside and make it the corner sort of disappear in this mirage. His next project that he discussed was in Korea, part of a series of permanent follies led by the government of Gwangju. And the government was not interested in a biennale where architects come and they build a temporary pavilion. It's reported in the sort of intellectual press and then torn down. Here, the city council wanted permanent infrastructure for the citizens. So it, I think, challenges the architects who participate to create, to get to know the community. And what Adjaye saw was this interesting tradition in the community where the residents, particularly the elderly, would bring books and newspapers to read by the river and then leave them there neatly stacked up to sort of be exchanged with the community. So from street level, you see this great black sort of arch, and then you walk forward and it is a step down to the riverfront with bookshelves all around. But of course, as an architect, he doesn't photograph it with any books stacked here. He's utilizing similar construction techniques to what we saw with Bill Massie and shop architects, exploiting the sort of beauty of repeated angled lumber. And then the site connects to this pedestrian bridge across the river. And so he provides this link between two sides of the city through this wonderful sort of open air folly in the landscape. In 2008, he won 2 competitions to design new libraries in Washington, D.C. And he wanted a building that would weave together the neighborhood and the natural landscape. As part of becoming a more sustainable architectural culture, we have to question all glass buildings. And Adjaye is part of that questioning. This is actually only a 40% glazed building because half of the windows are actually mirrors. And so at night, the building transforms into this harlequin pattern, and the entire building is shaded like an umbrella by this brise soleil, or sunscreen, going atop the building. And it really does provide thermal insulation to a climate that he was quick to point out in his lecture is the same as many of his projects in Africa, the subtropical Washington, D.C. Inside, very simple, humble materials, sort of thrillingly deployed. And if you notice, as the library moves around in space, the angle of the Harlequin pattern is actually changing, expressing the different functions and how much light you need into each room. I think quite excitingly for the children, that stairway leads up to a sort of suspended loft for the children's reading room. He did design two libraries in DC, and both serve communities in Washington that are predominantly African American. And while Adjaye, I think, has taken on the role as the world's Black architect, that is as much an indictment about why aren't there other Black architects? And he is, in interviews and in writings, rather reluctant to be this figurehead. At the same time, he talks about the power of building a library for little Black boys and girls from a Black architect, and the power of demonstrating a career that has been traditionally an all-white field. And so these libraries, I think, function on multiple levels of both design and sort of representation. On the other side of the world, the project that he spent the most time with in his Cranbrook lecture, and which is absolutely amazing, bonkers, is this Moscow equivalent to the Harvard Business School. And Adjaye entered this competition, and he was the only one who looked at the brief and then looked at the climate of Moscow. And as he was sitting looking at all the competition entries alongside his, everyone was proposing this sort of Jeffersonian ideal of a campus with buildings and a lawn. And he was thinking, it is -30 for 4 months of the year. Who wants to shovel that much snow? He proposes instead the university as one 1,000 square foot disc that houses all of the school program. And then on top of that disc would be 200 student bedrooms, a luxury hotel, a bodybuilding, which is the spa and gym, and a library. And below the 1,000 square foot disc would be all of the parking and services. As it sits in the landscape in this disc, it is going back to Adjaye's interest in Russian constructivism and the sort of revolutionary ideas in architecture of the 1920s in Russia of lifting buildings and otherwise detaching them from the earth, and also Russian painting. And he ended up discovering that Malevich was actually buried in a cemetery directly next to his Malevichian inspired constructivist building. Now you drive under the disc and then you emerge through a series of stairways into these sort of stark interiors. Above, you can then look down into these clouds of light onto the disc. And the gymnasium and the rooms have these angled windows that directly tie back to what Adjaye said is his favorite house, the home of Melnikov in Moscow, which is a great sort of futurist constructivist architectural work. And so you have these two great Russian discs on display. And the campus has since been expanded by Herzog and de Meuron with another giant circle of even larger diameter. Now, all of this leads us up to the building that you hopefully know Mr. Adjaye for, which is the 23rd of 22 Smithsonian campuses, stretching from New York to Washington to Virginia and Maryland. The Smithsonian Institution is a collection of architecture reflecting, I think, the evolution from 1850 to 2005 at the time. And as Adjaye looked at all of these projects, he was especially interested not in the sort of classicism or modern classicism, but in the modern Smithsonians, particularly the circle of Gordon Bunshaft for the Hirshhorn, the triangles of I.M. Pei. He said, joked, I think, in the Cranbrook lecture, there was a circle, there was a triangle, I had to do a square. It's very sort of Platonic modernist view of how a museum grouping might be. In actuality, the square is derived from the site, and the form of it, this corona, this sort of tapering crown, is derived from Nigerian sculpture and architectural elements, particularly these wooden veranda posts that are caryatids. Think of the Acropolis in Egypt with the column represented by the body. And so this post has a crown that is sculpted in these three great triangular forms. And for Adjaye, you cannot understand African American history and culture without understanding African culture. And so for him to bring this element of Africa and not necessarily African American design, which every other competition entry relied on, was to him part of what makes African American culture so distinct and so interesting. It is the continued exchange between the two places. Now, he says that his site was given this panopticon where it could look towards all of the major buildings, the National Archives, the Capitol, the White House, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Washington. And it finishes this row of Smithsonian institutions. It then relates to the site in a fundamentally different way through metal instead of stone, but it has these keys into its specific Washington locale, like sharing the same angle from the top of the Washington Monument with the angle of the corona shape. The side is actually made of cast aluminum that has been then coated with anodized bronze, and he was inspired by Charleston iron screens, which were made by enslaved labor in Charleston. And what Adjaye took was both the climate control and visual screening of iron railings and screens, as well as the overall design, where he took one example of a screen, and in the computer, he connected the points where every acanthus leaf in the iron curled in on itself, added a point, connected them, further manipulated them in the computer, and that is the ultimate pattern that we're given. On the inside, we see the way that it provides visual and climate screening for this glassy museum interior. It is not even on all sides. They go from 60% density, blocking out 60% of the sun on the south, to only blocking out something like 35% on the north side. And he's very interested in how the building can be environmentally conscious in this subtropical climate. So linking both to the vernacular porch architecture of the American South, but also in a very real way to the prevailing breezes of the National Mall, he covers the entrance with this cantilevered porch where wind comes in across this body of water to cool, and then it slips in between a gap between the screen and the building. And so it always has this sort of air circulation as you enter the building. Now, most of the museum is underground. And I should mention that it is a collaboration between three Black architects, Freelon, Adjaye, and Bond, who each worked for different firms but came together to enter the competition, thinking that they would have a stronger shot, bringing together all of their diverse experience, and also again reflecting the fact that there is no American architecture led by a Black principal. On the inside, most of the museum is underground, and it was important that it be like every other Smithsonian and based in physical objects. It is not a recreation of history, it is history gathered together and experienced by the visitor. And so by the end of by this point in time, by 2016, the Smithsonian has two radical new buildings. One by an Indigenous Canadian architect, Douglas Cardinal, and another by a Ghanaian British architect. And Mabel Wilson, the great architect, professor, and historian, talks about the power of this building and how it stands across the street from this, or across the mall from the Smithsonian Castle. And the castle, I wasn't aware, really is rooted in this sort of racial politics of its era, where the senators overseeing its construction told the architect to not look towards Southern European architecture, but towards the Germanic and the English architectural histories, and to make a building that was distinctly American, and for them that meant distinctly Northern European. And even the red sandstone of the castle was quarried by enslaved workers. And Mabel Wilson talks about how do you incorporate a new museum into an institution whose founding overwhelmingly excluded it. And the power of a shiny bronze corona, this new form in the landscape, not raised up on a giant stairway on a plinth, but open, glassy to all, reflecting a diverse cast of architects as its designers and reflecting part of the American story that the Smithsonian had previously been neglecting, and the importance of this building as a reflection of our culture, of our history, and part of the sort of continuation of the American story. I think that David Adjaye's fame is genuinely inspiring to young Black creative professionals, and he is a rock star. You could tell in the energy in the video of his lecture at Cranbrook. I think it's a lot of pressure on him, and it's pressure that I'm not sure, based on interviews, he's always accepted. But he talks about seeing his own children, and that if he can be an example for other architects, well, then he will continue to build buildings as a Black man, and continue to build he has in America, buildings, public housing in Harlem, the new Princeton Art Museum, and a skyscraper in Lower Manhattan, and his focus in the Middle East and Africa, in Nigeria, the UAE, and in Ghana, its new cathedral. I hope that I've presented three architects who are as inspiring to you as they are to me. I think that they reflect a hope and an optimism of where architecture can go that is very different from the sort of high theory abstraction of the previous 2 weeks. These are architects who find great joy in building, but also find great joy in building a better world through architecture. I think for Jeanne Gang, her projects bring architecture and their users closer to their surroundings physically and intellectually. And I think that in her practice, she has said, I want to have it all. It is my practice and I will define it for a social good. And I will merge my ideals with my practice. For Pasquarelli, the guiding principles of practice, politics, finance, technology, and sustainability mean that his architecture, he's deeply involved in all aspects from design to construction. In his lecture at Cranbrook, he ended with a comment that the most sustainable architecture is architecture like Cranbrook, that's beautifully built, well built, and well loved, because then it won't be demolished too soon. And David Adjaye, who is redefining, I think, both the aesthetics and design, but also what it means to be a global architect and where global architecture can work. Now, I know we're running out of time, but I would be remiss without acknowledging the fact that the great department established by Eliel Saarinen in 1931 is very much alive. And it's currently led by Gretchen Wilkins, who is a practicing and teaching architect with some 20 years of experience in Michigan, Australia, and Vietnam. She's interested in new industrial building types for high rise in the developing world. And she has brought to Cranbrook an energy of exploration and a dedication to making Cranbrook a school of architecture within the context of a school of art, where students can continue to explore and create new ideas through independent study. Cranbrook's architecture department is like no other architecture department in the country. There's certainly a place and a type of student for Yale, for Princeton, for University of Michigan, for Lawrence Technological University, architects who do want to get licensed and who want to go and work for these firms. But what I think I've shown tonight is that to be a modern, successful architectural practice, you have to have a variety of designers and ideas. And you have to have those architects and those students of architecture who come from research-based practice where new ideas are explored and defined. And that is where I think the Cranbrook architecture student can sit going forward, because Jeanne Gang and David Adjaye and Gregg Pasquarelli need architects who have different ways of thinking and who have a different set of training in their firm. Now, Gretchen has continued this excellence of visitors to Cranbrook with just this year, Winnie Moss from the Netherlands and Adam Nathaniel Thurman earlier this month. And I highly encourage all of you to sign up for Mabel O. Wilson's talk on March 11th. As one of just 500 licensed Black women architects in the country, that's out of 150,000 licensed architects, so 0.2%. She represents an optimistic future, and I know her lecture and her practice will be inspiring to the current students and to all of you who sign up for that public lecture. Over the past 5 weeks, we have talked about a range of architects in a range of styles. I hope that you have enjoyed getting to know some designers and architects better, and I hope that I've introduced you to new ideas, new theories, and new concepts in architecture within this framework of tracing 5 little periods, little half decades of time where architecture in America and architecture at Cranbrook intersected in these really interesting and inspiring visits. Thank you all so much. Now, this is the most I've run over in the series, but if you have questions, do feel free to type them into the chat or to unmute yourself for the questions. And while you all are thinking about your question, and I'm sure coming up with something to throw me for a loop, I do just want to briefly remind you of events that are coming up from Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. If you signed up for this lecture series, we have your email and we'll send out emails on Wednesdays. If you're the visitor or guest from someone else, head over to center.cranbrook.edu, scroll all the way to the bottom and sign up for our emails. That's how you'll be invited to our Historic Artist Homes and Studios lecture on March 14th with the director of that program from the National Trust of Historic Preservation. And on March 28th, I will be delivering another lecture about Saarinen House, Cranbrook House, and the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House, and discussing a student intervention that I have been in the throes of working with some 50 students trying to get very experimental art on display and photographed here in the houses. That's coming up on March 28th. And on May 22nd is our fundraiser, a global house party at Cranbrook and Millis Garden. And so I do want to invite you all to those upcoming events. And of course, every Wednesday, I talk about the art, architecture, and Cranbrook history on Facebook Live at 5 p.m. Eastern, and those will continue. With that long plug out of the way, Alyssa, or if anyone has questions.
We have a few in the chat. Go ahead, Abby.
I just want to say thank you. I learned a lot from the series, and it was a great series. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for coming. Avi is our 4th grader from Brookside School, Cranbrook, and I was very interested in architecture at your age. I think you're going to do great things, and always keep your eyes open and keep your opinions open as well, because architecture is a fascinating and wide field, and the more we learn and the more we see, the better our lives become.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
We had a few in the chat. Jeanne Gang's Aqua Tower, how many floors are in that building?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's like 82, or maybe her Vista Tower is 82. She now has designed the tallest 2 skyscrapers a woman has ever designed. Vista Tower is just coming to completion also in Chicago. The Aqua Tower sits on a 70-foot podium that has retail, offices, and the largest rooftop park in Chicago. And then it is the residences all the way up. And it opened in the middle of the Great Recession, and somehow, remarkably, was 94% sold when she was lecturing here in 2010. So kind of a miracle that that tower was ever built.
Is there any chance that this series has been recorded?
It has, and if you would like to rewatch it yourself, just email Alyssa at center@cranbrook.edu for the link. If you want to share it with others, this is our major winter fundraiser. And so in order to continue preserving, sharing, and keeping my job, we do need to keep selling tickets to this. So if you have someone who would enjoy the series, we absolutely can send out a packet with all the links, but we do request that we keep the ticket fee there.
Of course. We have an architect daughter who I'm sure would enjoy it, but the timing is not good for her.
Excellent. I also want to add that I will be sending out a reading list, if not this week, early next week, that includes many of the books that I used from Cranbrook's library or ordered on my own, because what better way to spend all your money than filling your house with books? Sarden House is just going to collapse under the weight of my library eventually, but I will send out an annotated reading list that also includes some of the links to the videos. Architecture today is all about recording itself in film, and so I didn't trust the Zoom technology, but when you get that reading list, do open it, because I think some of these projects are really beautifully represented in film.
Would you include the link for Alyssa, please? For accessing the
you can just hit reply all to the emails that you've gotten with the links.
Okay.
Yep. Not reply all, but reply.
Other
questions?
What's the next class that we can take?
Great question. I'll be back next winter for History of American Architecture, but if this is your first series with me in the fall, and we'll start it up again at some point, I've been doing Uncovering Cranbrook lectures, where I talked about Frank Lloyd Wright in Japan, Cranbrook in the Bauhaus, Cranbrook in weaving as architecture. So do keep your eye on emails, because I do tend to make a lot of PowerPoints and talk. On this Friday, if you head over to the Yale University Art Gallery's website, I'll be delivering a talk on innovations in plywood at Yale. So that is free. You can head, if you're fearing withdrawals, that's Friday at noon. Other questions?
Kevin, I have a question for you in the chat. The migratory bird center you described sounded like it was never built. Can you talk a little bit about that?
She writes in at least 2019, when she published her latest book, that it's actually still on the drawing board. It's a public-private project, and so it just hasn't been realized. The site, I think, needs a lot of remediation. That would be federal funding, and so that funding perhaps in the last 4 years wasn't forthcoming in the south side of Chicago. And so hopefully that is a project that could be realized, and the whole idea of it, of building essentially a bird's nest of material, it continues to be relevant. I mean, she could bring it back at any moment. So hopefully one day that will be in a landmark in that little architectural desert.
All the projects are so ambitious, and there's so many people involved in each building. Does the architect have to approve every single detail since their name goes on the final building? Do any of the other collaborators get credit?
Great question. And I really styled my credits tonight by the firm. What is a change in architectural publications is that both Shop's monograph and Jeanne Gang's monograph, in the back of it, they do buildings, and then they do all of the contractors, subcontractors, consultants, but also everyone in the office. And I think that is a very new idea, whereas earlier firms, it was, I am Elizabeth Diller, and this is my building. Yet we know she has 50 employees. Today, it is much more likely that a firm is going to give that credit where credit is due. At the same time, an office like Shop, which takes the naming nomenclature of the 90s, where all firms were becoming Shop, OMA, Work AC, they all get these little pithy names. That's more confusing because they just have a name, and so they've added partners in addition to the original 5. For Studio Gang, her husband is a partner, but you would not know that by looking at it. And I loved at Cranbrook, she got a kind of a leading question that probably wouldn't be asked in 2021, I would hope. And she responds and she says, of course I have a team, but as a woman, of course I can also be an architect. And ultimately, I'm paying the bills. It's my studio, and these are my buildings. And I just loved her sort of strength, her conviction to just go with like, yes, I did build these buildings. So architecture is a team sport. No one is sitting alone creating these pieces. It is so far away from Frank Lloyd Wright's uh, day and age. I think what Gregg Pasquarelli and Shop were advocating was, instead of using all those consultants and eventually having no architecture left because it's such a sprawling team, how much of it can you bring in? And that's why they actually have multiple offices. They have shop construction, shop works, shop. They have all types of divisions so that everything is internal and they have greater control on that architecture. Any other questions?
You know, Kevin, I had a question. The second to the last slide in the bottom right was a picture of a contemporary structure with the peristyle in the background. What was that?
That's student work from the architecture students. So the architecture students do head over to Cranbrook Academy's website to read more about how the architecture program works. I'm sorry that in this series, I was so focused on the visitors. The architecture students are incredibly self-directed. And so those students who want to create buildings are material experimentation have the chance to then use the campus as their playground. It is what I'm trying to do with this series of interventions with the art students. Why have a National Historic Landmark that we exert a lot of love, time, energy, and money preserving if we're not going to use it as part of the educational mission? So instead of just having the architects build little follies in the landscape, I'm hoping to have the ceramicists and the metalsmiths and the graphic designers all be participating in installation like what you saw.
Was that an installation or a rendering?
Oh, installation. It's a real thing. Yeah.
Oh, is it there now?
No, it was the graduate degree show, I think from 2015.
Oh, okay. Got it. Cool.
Thank you. So one question that was asked this morning that I'm going to repeat here because I so enjoyed it, and then I will let everyone go, was someone asked if I could have 3 visitors from any time come to Cranbrook and speak, who would my 3 visitors be? And they caught me a little off guard. But the 3 people who I think should have come to Cranbrook, and I wish they had, were Charles Moore, Zaha Hadid, and Sir Edwin Landseer Lutyens. Those are the voices that, if you want to learn more about architecture, they never came to Cranbrook. They really should have come to Cranbrook, and they deserve your attention. So maybe in our next class, I'll figure out a way to talk about them. Thanks so much for joining the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research on this 5-week whirlwind journey from the 1890s right up to 2021. I hope that it's given you a better and fuller understanding of architecture across the century, from the age of the master builder and the revolutionary architect through to the age of high theory and abstraction, and into what I think is an optimistic future where architecture can again become a relevant and socially active participant in our daily lives. Architecture is my great joy in life. I know it brings you joy because you've put up with me for this long. Keep your eyes open, look up, take trips, go and explore once it's safe to do so. Thanks so much for joining me for another History of American Architecture lecture series. Until next time.